We are going inside Cooper Webb's 2022 Red Bull Factory Racing KTM 450 SXF Factory Edition. This is the all-new bike that Cooper Webb has at his disposal this year. There's been a lot of press about it going into the early rounds. You've probably seen some of the videos, even some of ours, about really what's new with this bike. But today we're gonna dive a little bit deeper and talk about what it takes to go from that machine to the bike that Cooper Webb is currently racing on track. Everything you see visually about this bike is as it was at Anaheim 1, and that's what we are basing most of this video off of. Since Cooper Webb arrived at Red Bull KTM, he has been paired with Carlos Rivera, who was nice enough to go through this bike with us, take us the full tour, and give us the time to really nitpick and shoot every inch of this bike. Carlos has worked for many big names in the sport, including Davey Millsaps and Ryan Dungey, and has been at KTM pretty much since Roger DeCoster went over there. He was one of the people handpicked to come in and help really revolutionize KTM's US racing program. What's really interesting with any of the Red Bull KTMs, whether we're talking about the bike in the US, their MXGP bike, World Enduro, everything, is the bikes look very similar. They use the same key partners really worldwide, and they keep those close themselves. They only work with a few brands, so the bikes, yes, they look trick. There's some really cool goodies going on here, but at the same time, it's not out there as far as some other teams are. You don't see real wild components or really crazy aftermarket brands or things that really depart the bike from production. They tend to keep working with the same couple brands worldwide. And with that, you see items like Akrapovic, Hinson, Renthal, Motomaster, Brembo, Celadorali. These items are really common amongst their bikes, along with working with the partners like WP, Penkel, CP. Really only one of the major differences we see between the US and the MXGP bike is the tires. For the MXGP team is Pirelli, and the US Supercross team is Dunlop. Starting with the most obvious exotic is the suspension on Cooper's bike. For many years now, KTM has been known for using a 52mm version of WP's cone valve system fork. The modern day terminology from WP for the suspension components are Exact Pro. There is a 48mm version of this fork that is of course available to the public. However, this 52mm version is a little bit harder to come by. Something that some people confuse is what that 52mm stands for. It is nothing to do with the upper fork legs. It's actually all about the lower fork tubes, or stanchions in this case. This is 3mm larger than we see with pretty much any of Showa's offerings right now on their race team bikes, and a whopping 4mm larger than what we see with KYB. But what really stands out with this is it's a different material combination. With all the other brands we mentioned, you have a steel chrome lower tube mated with an aluminum upper tube. The WP is aluminum both top and bottom. They need this little bit larger tubing to make the aluminum bottom tube work. And their main reason for that we've been explained to in the past on why they do this is by having both tubes being made of a similar material, they get similar flex characteristics out of it. In the past, we've seen KTM jump around with their axle sizes, and with the axles, the only thing we really see amongst the team in difference is the material. Some of the riders on the team tend to use titanium, and some choose to use production steel. The reason being for this is it has a different stiffness, a different flex character, and could just produce a different feel to the rider. The KTM bike is already so light at production and extremely light in race trim that the difference between running the tire or the steel axle isn't a make or break for them, as their bike is already right at the weight limit. Talking a little bit more about the forks, everybody hears the term cone valve. It's basically a valving system on the damping rods. Some fork manufacturers use a mid-speed valve, which basically has a piston and a shim stack, while on the WP system we've seen a cone that enters an orifice that uses oil passing by to shear and create friction and damping forces. Another interesting fact about the current version of these Works forks is they do have the ability to remove the bleed screw and actually enter a Schrader valve. This would allow them to turn the fork into an air assist fork. We've heard that they've played around with this a little bit at times. And when we say air assist, the fork itself is still using the majority of its spring rate off the metal coil spring, but by adding a Schrader valve, they can control that pressure by maybe, 1, 2, or 3 PSI to help with bottoming resistance and bottoming control in some of the supercross situations these guys see themselves in. The shock is the latest version of WP Exact Pro components. A lot of people still call this a track shock, but really it doesn't have the track system that we were used to from a couple generations ago. It does have high and low speed compression damping adjustment, and it also has a high and low speed rebound damping system down in the clevis. You'll basically find what looks like a rebound adjuster on each side. As far as we're aware, the chassis on this motorcycle is either identical to production or has only been modified ever so slightly. In past seasons, we have seen the large cross member welded into the cradle area of the factory KTMs for Supercross, and we also know that they were doing gusseting in other areas of the frame to try to stiffen it under certain loads and conditions, mostly again for the rigors of Supercross in the US. But a lot of things that KTM have done to this frame has been to try to get away from needing all that gusseting and try to make the bike work in a wider range of situations. If you want to learn more about that frame, check out our first look video on the production version of this bike, and we go into a bit more detail about how KTM has really changed their design function and theory with their frames, mostly working from the shock tower area. The frame is the largest change. Up at the front of the bike is KTM's own in-house factory triple clamp, which they do sell to the public through their Power Parts catalog. The race team, however, has a few options in store here. They do have some offsets they can test, albeit at the moment the team is on the standard 22mm offset for Supercross. And they also have an option of flex character / rigidity with the clamp. It's really popular to see the one that they sell having a split window design, and Cooper Webb at the moment is on that clamp, albeit the team also has a solid option which we've seen them in testing swap back and forth with, but at the time of recording this, Webb has chosen the one that probably has a little bit more flex, maybe a little bit more comfort or front end feel with the split design. The only other major chassis component or suspension component to speak of in this case that's really different on this bike is the linkage and the bell crank. It is, from what we're aware, extremely close to the stock item, but we do see teams like this ever so slightly changing that ratio. Not really that there's a problem with the consumer version ratio, but it was designed around consumer needs. In the race team situation, it's really common to see them go for a setup that has less leverage towards the end of the stroke, basically meaning that the shock will be stiffer. For a consumer, this ramp up might be too much, be too violent, and doesn't really allow the bike to utilize all the stroke. But in the rigors of Supercross, the speed of these guys, especially somebody like Webb, who is a champion, defending champion in this case, it just gives them that little bit of extra hold up they need. The swing arm on this bike is standard. A few years back, KTM used to actually modify their stock swing arms to try to get more axle spacing out of it, so they had a wider range of adjustment. But in the last couple years, KTM has adopted that from the race team to the production design, and the KTM does have the widest amount of adjustment in the rear axle. So they're not really stuck if they switch. You see some teams when they switch to a certain sprocket size, they have trouble getting, their axle placement where they want. A certain sprocket might make them go too far forward and they run out of adjustment, or they might be too far back. The KTM has a large enough spacing that they can go anywhere from the team's standard like 1350-ish range, then go into the 51s and the 49s and be able to really move the axle around and get a length that they're looking for that'll appease the rider's needs. When it comes to the engine department, it's been pretty well known that KTM doesn't get too far out in left field with these bikes, and that a lot of the components we see in the engine are either stock or extremely close to stock and using the exact same suppliers. Inside the engine, we see components from Penkel and CP Carrillo primarily. These are both companies that KTM has part ownership or investments in a way. For Penkel, the transmissions are made by them, the cranks and rods. As far as we're aware, is the transmission ratio on this bike should be the same as stock. Sometimes you do see a slightly changed first gear option that's a little bit wider, but as far as we're aware, again, this is the same as the production consumer version. The piston is made by CP, again, who makes the production piston. The race piston would be ever so slightly different, whether that's the doming, the coatings they use, or changing the compression slightly. We've heard that the head is extremely close to stock, just slightly hand massaged and poured in a couple places, but nothing crazy like you'd think of when you hear a guy poured and polishing a head. The valve train all comes from Del West production, as long for the race items, and we've heard that the cam in this bike is likely stock as well, albeit KTM usually degrees the stock cam to a slightly different position to again change the power for the character they're looking for for their riders. In this case, Cooper Webb, Aaron Plessinger, and Marvin Muscan at the time of recording this video are all mechanically on the same engine component combo. All the clutch components are provided by Hinson. Again, this is a worldwide partner of KTM, and we see these components throughout all factory Red Bull KTM racing efforts. The brake components on the bike are supplied by Brembo, same as their production supplier. We do see what they call their SXS calipers, front and rear on the bike. The rear caliper just has some different coatings, a little bit different tolerances. The front caliper does have larger pistons, and they do have multiple options to choose from. And mostly when you have piston size, people automatically think of more power. But another thing that comes into play is the combination of piston sizes. What is down below versus what is the push piston up top. You can go larger down below and larger up top. It could create a lot of power, but some little bit of maybe vagueness as there's so much fluid movement. And then at times we've seen KTM in the past maybe run a little bit larger pistons down below with the Brembo SXS caliper, but run a standard or maybe even one of the smaller options on the up top piston, which might create a little bit more overall lever throw, but a little bit finer feel. It's just one of those things that really allows the team to fine tune even the smallest aspect of this bike for the rider. Akrapovic has been KTM's longtime exhaust supplier. In this case, they work so closely with KTM that the production system you see that will be available to the consumer was basically developed on this race bike. They've worked hand in hand with KTM, and they've been working on this system with KTM as they've been developing the bike over the past year or two. And the system we see on the US Supercross team is typically unique for them. We've seen differences in head pipe lengths and diameters between the MXGP team and the US team. And like I said before, this comes down to the rigors of Supercross and the exact power characteristic that the guys here are looking for. Akrapovic also goes through and makes all the carbon fiber goodies that we've seen on the KTM bikes, from their skid plates to their chain guides, and we've heard over and over from their staff at how high of a quality these components are, to the point that they almost never have to replace anything on the bike that is made by them. The bars, grips, and sprockets are all provided, of course, by Renthal. And then the chain and rims on the bike are from DID. The chain is a DID ERT3, which does use a rivet link instead of a master link clip. KTM kind of has this as a standard amongst the racing operation, and all the mechanics are required to do this to their motorcycles. Some of the last partners we see on the bike are Kite, who has been a longtime provider of their hubs. They also provide the slave cylinder for the hydraulic clutch. It's more of a bling part. It's just a little bit higher quality than the stock piece, but it's not really a performance item. The foot pegs on this bike are pretty unique. They look stock, but they're actually 3D printed titanium to the exact profile of the new stock peg, albeit a little bit sharper. Like I said, from a distance, you would totally play these off and think that it's just a stock peg on the bike, but it's honestly one of the absolute most trick pieces on this motorcycle. Another interesting fact in talking to the KTM staff is the fact that their riders like more of a manual input on the bike, especially Cooper. He does not run any type of launch control system. He does it all off feel and his repeatability from practicing his starts. And we also know that the team has not been using the quick shifter that comes production on the stock bike. They haven't found that they really need an advantage for it in Supercross, and it's also just one less item to have engaged on the bike that could go possibly wrong. Thanks for joining us on this inside look at Cooper Webb's factory racing Red Bull KTM 450. If you like this feature, make sure you give us a thumbs up.